morning, morning, morning. Good morning. Good morning to you.
There are some labor men who have worked hard and toiled long in love of country, in love of the space we know as the West Indies. And there was a time when they took some time to decide, let's be federal. And you're asking yourself, what is that? Well, Ambassador David Comissiong joins us now to take a look at that and a whole lot more. And these people, these labor men, Ambassador, good morning.
Good morning. Morning, Pearson.
So when we talk about a federation, what were we talking about?
I wanted us to focus on the West Indies Federation at this commencement of Black History Month because it was one of our Caribbean's greatest achievements. It was also one of our greatest tragedies. Yet, people of my generation and younger, those of us who were born in the decade of the 60s and more recently, we have virtually no idea about this great project that those who came before us were involved in. And I think that's a shame because, just as you said, there were heroes. There were really outstanding Caribbean labor leaders, politicians, statesmen, who worked over decades to create this West Indies Federation that unfortunately only lasted for 4 years. And we don't know, they're lost from view. And so if I said to Barbadians, are you aware of Sir Archibald Cooke and the role that he played in the British West Indies Federation? I will draw a blank. Or Dr. Arnott Cato. Of course, we know a bit about Sir Grantley Adams. But I think it's important that we take the time to recall these men and this great project in our history.
So let's go to the beginning. There's always the beginning. So let's look at who were the people who pioneered the idea of the Federation.
Yes, I would say three giants that we need to be conscious of. I would give pride of place to Theophilus Albert Marichaux of Grenada. Who was one of the early labor leaders going way back to the 19 teens, the very beginning of the 20th century. And he started the movement to fight for representative government of the native people of Grenada in the then British colony of Grenada. And then, of course, in Trinidad, you had Captain Arthur Cipriani, another early labor leader. He had served in the British West Indian Regiment in the First World War. He came back. He revived the Trinidad Working Men's Association, and he made his contribution from Trinidad. And then in Guyana, you had, born in Guyana, but of Barbadian parentage. His father was a Barbadian migrant to Guyana. Hubert Nathaniel Critchlow, who started the first trade union in the Caribbean in 1917, the British Guyana Labor Union. So I would say that these were the three initial giants who came together in 1926 in the British Guyana and West Indies Labor Conference in Guyana. And they launched the idea that these colonies of these West Indian colonies of Britain, they wanted to come together in a federation and they wanted self-government. Because back then they were all British colonies with no self-government. So they said, our demand, the demand of the labor movement of the Caribbean to you, Britain, to you, British Colonial Office, is federation and self-government. So that was the start of the project way back in 1926. And they formed the British Guyana and West Indies Labor Congress. That Congress met again in the 1930s in the midst of, the people's rebellions of the 1930s. They re-emphasized our campaign is for federation, a political union of all of these colonies, and for them to be given virtual independent status as a political union. And so these were the three men who actually led the way until 1938. When, with the formation in Barbados of the Barbados Progressive League, which was the parent organization of the Barbados Labour Party and the Barbados Workers' Union, a man called Grantley Adams emerged on the scene. And Grantley Adams was the Barbados representative at the meeting of the British West Indies and Labour Congress in Trinidad in 1938 to prepare. The Moyne Commission was coming down to the Caribbean from Britain as a result of the Labour rebellions. And the Labour leaders were meeting in Trinidad to prepare for the Moyne Commission. And Grantley produced a draft constitution for a federation of the British West Indies. And they all accepted Grantley's document and said, yes, this is what we're going to go with, this is what we're going to put forward. And from then onwards, from 1938, Grantley Adams then begins to take over the baton from the old stalwarts, Marichaud, Critchlow, and Cipriani.
But there were some other people with him who also, because as I was listening to him, thinking, one, to have had the thought and the foresight at that point in the early 1920s to decide this is how I'm going to challenge so soon after the abolition of slavery, and then to be so forward thinking about what it could mean for the region. And at that time, the challenges with communication, because you had Guyana, Trinidad, and Grenada talking the same language at that point, without having the benefit of a cell phone as we have it today, so that you can share in that kind of way, must have been in itself quite interesting at times.
Yeah, it was remarkable that they were able to have that unity. Because, Britain had come to this region, had set up these colonies, and had done very little to put these colonies in contact with each other. Every colony was associated with the mother country. So all the links were, vertical links to Britain rather than horizontal links to each other. And the idea of coming together, the British only harbored that idea in a very limited way. So they would, for example, want to have a governor for Barbados and the Windward Islands, or governor for Barbados and the Leewards, and so forth. So for them, Caribbean unity was only about their administrative convenience. It was nothing of real substance, and it was nothing to meet the aspirations of the Caribbean people for nationhood and for independence. So for these labor leaders, in the midst of that kind of social milieu, to be able to have that commonality of purpose and to be able to work together was remarkable. But I think what caused that remarkable early unity was the fact that they were all fighting the same common struggle. They were fighting against British colonialism. They all wanted self-government of their countries and ultimately independence. And the idea took root that, look, we can only achieve these things if we come together. If we don't come together, we will never get the self-government, the independence, the nationhood from this British Empire. So that is what kind of bound them together. They formed this British Guyana and West Indies Labour Congress. And in 1945, they had a very, very important meeting of the Labour Congress in Barbados. And of course, this was when the BLP and the Barbados Workers' Union had come to full maturity. And at that Congress, they really solidified these demands for federation and independence, self-governance. And so they changed the name of their organization to the Caribbean Labour Congress. Yeah, they changed it to the Caribbean Labour Congress, and they installed Grantley Adams as their second vice president. They were still tipping their hat to the old stalwarts. So Marichaud was made president. Critchlow was made first vice president, but the rising man was Grantley Adams, and he was made second vice president. So from 1945, the movement, the old stalwarts now really give way to the Grantley Adams, Albert Gomes in Trinidad and Tobago, Norman Manley, then from Jamaica, then comes on the scene. And of course, he comes on the scene with his nemesis, Alexander Bustamante, who eventually emerges as something of a villain in the piece, who kind of, made it very difficult for the Federation to survive. But from 1945, the story then shifts to the Caribbean Labor Congress, and Norman Manley, Grantley Adams as the two leading men in the Caribbean Labor Congress. And of course, this was the end of the Second World War. A new Labour government had taken office in England, and that new Labour government finally was willing to meet the demands for, yes, we agree, there should be a federation. And so the new Labour government in 1947 decided to hold a conference in Montego Bay, where finally this matter would be put on the table and there would be some resolution. So Grantley Adams and Norman Manley, they went on a speaking tour of the United States, where they raised money so that they could bring the whole Caribbean Labour Congress together in Jamaica for that very important conference with the British. And they held their preparatory conference in Kingston in 1947. And they came to some very firm demands. We are going to tell the British we want a federation, a political union, and we want Dominion status. Dominion status back then was basically independence. It was what the British had given to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Newfoundland, and the Irish Free State. These were known as the White Commonwealth. So the British had given all of the white colonies, they'd basically given them independence. They call it Dominion status, full autonomy to express themselves as an independent nations. And so this is what the Caribbean Labour Congress demanded for the West Indian colonies. However, when the conference was held in Montego Bay in 1947, the British refused to give them. The British said, okay, we will agree with the federation, but we are not willing to agree to give you Dominion status, that is autonomy, virtual independence. So the federation will still have a colonial structure. And I think that was one of the fatal defects. And you have to ask yourself, why was the British government not willing to give the black West Indian colonies the same
as it did to the
status as the white? And then also, one of the reasons that Bustamante was given fuel to lead his anti-federation charge, at that conference Bustamante said, but you have to give us, you British government, if we are to embark on this federation, you have to give us substantial financial resources. And of course, nowadays we talk about reparations, and we make the point that Britain really owed the Caribbean territories reparations, substantial reparations. And that was an occasion when the British really should have said, yes, we have exploited you for hundreds of years. Now that you are going to be making your way as a political union, we will give you significant resources. Britain did just the opposite. So so we went into the federation. Eventually it was launched in 1958. But we went in with two disabilities that we can blame the British for. It was not an independent federation. It was still a colonial structure. And the financial resources that it really should have been given from the very outset to properly finance it, Britain refused to give. So we went in, and then the story really shifts to those 4 years and what the Federation accomplished. Grantley Adams ultimately became the Prime Minister. The Labour parties came together in 1956, and they formed a Caribbean-wide political party. Again, many people are not aware of this, but all the Labour parties came together and formed the West Indies Federal Labour Party. Norman Manley was the president, Grantley Adams was the vice president. That party, they had federal elections. That party won the federal elections, but Norman Manley was so fearful of Alexander Bustamante back in Jamaica because you had to make a choice.
Yes.
You either had to remain, within your local parliament and chief minister or premier of your own individual country, or you became a federal minister, a federal parliamentarian. So you had to choose. Norman Manley chose to remain local Jamaican, whereas Grantley Adams said, okay, since Norman will not accept the position, I will accept. I will give up being Premier of Barbados, and I will take on that position. And so the seats in the federal parliament were 17 to Jamaica, 10 to Trinidad, 5 to Barbados, 2 each to the smaller St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Grenada, etc., and one to Montserrat. So the Barbados Labour Party contested as part of the West Indies Federal Labour Party, and they won 4 of the 5 seats in Barbados. And again, these are names, these men who became federal parliamentarians: Gilmore Rochford, Victor Vaughan, Dighton Ward, who later became a Governor General of Barbados, of course, Grantley Adams. And then there was an independent who won one of the seats in Barbados, Florence Dish.
Yes.
A female, and no less a white female at that, a social worker. And to everybody's surprise, she defeated, the BLP candidate, and she won her seat. And so Barbados those were the Barbadians who went into the federal structure. And Barbados was entitled to appoint 2 senators, and Barbados chose Sir Archibald Duke and Dr. Arnold Cato as our 2 senators. And also, the federal parliament was entitled to select or elect a Speaker of the House, and they chose a Barbadian, Erskine Ward, later Sir Erskine Ward. So these are names of people who played very historic roles in that federation that lasted for 4 years, and that did have substantial accomplishments, but that ultimately ended in disaster.
So how did it end, really?
Oh, well, during the period of the Federation, there were all kinds of squabbles. So there was a squabble initially over where would the capital be. Initially, the British had said it should be in Barbados. It was Barbados, Trinidad, Jamaica. It ended up being in Trinidad. Then there were squabbles over should the Federation impose taxes on the local units? Jamaica felt that they were advancing. Their bauxite had come on stream, tourism had come on stream, and they began to feel the Federation might hold back their individual advancement. Then there was squabbles over whether there should be freedom of movement. So internally, there were these squabbles. Bustamante lost power in Jamaica. Norman Manley came to power, and then Bustamante began to use the issue of federation as a local political issue. So you prey on the people that these small islands from the Eastern Caribbean will become a drag on Jamaica, and these people will come and take Jamaican jobs, and Jamaica will be held back, and etc. And Jamaica can get independence without being part of this federation. And ultimately, all of that, those local politics in Jamaica led to Premier of Jamaica, Norman Manley, deciding to hold a referendum in Jamaica as to whether Jamaica should continue in the Federation or not. That referendum was held in 1961, and 60% of the Jamaican electorate voted. 54% said no to Federation, 46% said yes to Federation. So it was a narrow loss for Federation, and Jamaica announced it was pulling out. Once Jamaica announced it was pulling out, of course, the two big territories were Jamaica and Trinidad. Then Dr. Eric Williams in Trinidad, he said his mathematics was, well, 1 from 10 leaves naught. If Jamaica is pulling out, Trinidad is not willing to continue because it will be too big a strain on Trinidad. He announced that Trinidad will be pulling out as well. Grantley Adams, as Prime Minister of the Federation, he was urging the British government, look, you really have to consult with the federal government. Even in spite of these two pulling out, we can still find a way to preserve the Federation. But then, tragedy hit in Barbados as well. His Barbados Labour Party, they lost the election in December of 1961. So that weakened his position as well. And by January of 1962, the British government had decided to pull the plug on the Federation. So the Federation was dissolved. But we should not, and it was a great tragedy, but there were some achievements. So we should remember that a federal capital was constructed in Trinidad. We should remember that the St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies was established in 1960 under the Federation. We should recall that the Federation actually went to the Olympics in 1960 and won 2 bronze medals, including our James Wedderburn as part of the 4x4. We should also recall that BWIA, that it was the Federation that negotiated with the then British BOAC, British Overseas Airways, that is now British Airways, to acquire their subsidiary BWIA, that had become a Caribbean institution. And very importantly, the Federation had established a shipping company. They had been donated two vessels by the Canadian government, the Federal Maple and the Federal Palm. So the Federation actually set up a shipping company that plied maritime transportation up and down the island. So the Federation did have some significant achievements during its 4 years, but when it collapsed, it was a tragedy. I remember Gene Holder, the Barbadian Gene Holder, who was one of the federal civil servants. I remember him telling me how that tears, big men and women actually, shed tears because this was a collapse of all their dreams, that, there were so many hopes attached to this nation, this new nation of the Caribbean, the West Indies Federation, and all of those dreams and hopes had come to naught. So that is part of Black history, that is part of Caribbean history that we should always remember. One of our greatest achievements, but one of our greatest tragedies as well, when it all collapsed in 1962.
I sat quietly listening to you because it's such an interesting story of our time. One of the takeaways for me is that all of this was led by labor men, people for the people, who were interested in seeing the development of the people. And it wasn't led necessarily by lawyers and economists and the like. It was led by people, even though lawyers began to play a role as time developed. But it just shows the power, again, of people. And so we are at the cusp of time in the Caribbean as well, where we're now tasked with re-engaging once again with CSME, CARICOM and the like. How do you see the example of the Federation being used to further the advancement of CARICOM?
Well, because of that collapse in 1962 and the great disappointment, the dashing of hopes, the West Indies was at a very low point in 1962. And then we have to credit Mr. Errol Barrow, who really stepped forward. And in the midst of all of that despair and collapse, he then picked up the pieces. And he said, okay, let us try to rebuild this unity, but let us go the gradual route of economic integration. So, you know, he conceptualized CARIFTA, the Free Trade Association that evolved into CARICOM. So ever since then, you know, that is what we have been doing. Mm-hmm. We have been gradually trying to get back to that level of unity and those great hopes and aspirations that we had with the political union known as the West Indies Federation, but we have been trying to do it gradually. But what I would say is that we have now arrived with our CARICOM and our single market and single economy. We have now arrived at a position of maturity that did not exist back then. You see, some of the behavior that took place back then, and you can tell what that behavior was a product of British colonialism. The fact that a lot of these labor men had not had any experience of running governments because of British colonialism. Barbados was one of the more fortunate colonies. We had a House of Assembly from 1639. Many of the other colonies never had that experience of running electoral systems and being involved in local parliamentary governance and so forth. So some of the squabbles between them you could put down to lack of experience. Now, I mean, we have our leaders as statesmen and women who have a maturity beyond that and know how to compromise, know how to see the bigger picture. So some of the things that brought down the Federation, some of the internal differences where men were more uncompromising, would not happen today. So I would say yes, we have learnt some of the lessons of what caused the failure, and we have matured beyond that now. But we have still never as great as CARICOM is, it is still not the political union, the nation, because that's what the Federation was. We were one nation. CARICOM, you know, we have much integration, but we are still not one nation. The Federation had its own flag, you know, its own anthem, its own capital. So the Federation remains a symbol of the unity, of the status, let me say, not say the unity, because it was in fact beset by disunity that we still have to aspire to. But part of the lessons too is that the British, because if Britain had done the right thing, if they had given those financial resources, and in today's parlance we say reparations, and if they had not allowed this racist construct to shape their thinking, and the Federation had been given dominion status, independent status from the outset, it would have survived. So those are lessons we need to, as Bajans say, pick sense from that as well, you know.
Ambassador Boy, this has been a really rich session indeed, and thank you so much for sharing this with us. So to bring it back to our four, those who did not know, you get to know for the first time as well, and I hope that in schools, information like this becomes a part of the everyday conversations, part of the everyday teaching, because lest we tell, no one will know.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pearson.
You're welcome.
Morning,